The encounter. The rain lashed against the windows of New York City, drenching the streets and reducing the usually vibrant skyline to a murky, gray blur. Richard Carrington, seated in the back of his chauffeured Rolls-Royce, stared out at the city's chaos with vacant eyes. At 55, he was an image of success, sharply dressed, adorned with a Rolex that gleamed under the faint interior light, and a reputation as one of Wall Street's most formidable financial magnates. But beneath the tailored suit and commanding presence, he carried an emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. As the car idled at a traffic light, Richard's gaze shifted to the sidewalk. There, under the scant shelter of a shop awning, an elderly woman huddled against the storm. Her wiry frame was cloaked in layers of tattered clothing, and her hands trembled as she clutched a drenched paper bag. Something about her fragile figure, stooped against the relentless rain, resonated with a part of Richard he had long buried. He leaned forward and tapped the glass partition. "Stop the car." The driver, accustomed to Richard's occasional whims, obeyed without question. Richard stepped out into the downpour, the cold rain soaking through his tailored suit in seconds. He approached the woman, who turned her weathered face toward him with startled, wary eyes. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather," Richard said, pulling a leather wallet from his pocket. "Take this." He handed her a bundle of cash without counting it, the crisp notes wilting slightly in the damp air. The woman hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the money. "God bless you," she whispered, her voice raspy but sincere. "You're an angel." Richard offered her a tight smile, his discomfort with the praise evident. As he turned to retreat to his car, the woman called after him. "Wait." Her voice was louder now, cutting through the rain. "What's your name, sir?" He hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice subdued. "Richard. Richard Carrington." The woman's expression flickered, a shadow of recognition crossing her face. "Carrington," she repeated softly, almost to herself. Before he could process her reaction, Richard was already moving toward the car, eager to escape the emotional weight that seemed to hang in the air. Back in the warmth of the car, Richard leaned his head against the window, the cold glass offering a strange solace. His mind drifted to the moment he handed her the money. $777. The amount wasn't arbitrary. It was a number etched into his life with painful precision, a number that had haunted and defined him for nearly 3 decades. The memory was as vivid as the storm outside. 27 years ago, on a similarly rain-drenched evening, his world had crumbled. Emily. Her name was a wound that refused to heal. She had been his heart, his future, and the one who made life worth living. But in a cruel twist of fate, she was taken from him on a day meant for celebration, her 23rd birthday. Richard closed his eyes as the memory engulfed him. He had planned every detail of that day, from the surprise party to the ring he intended to slip onto her finger. It was supposed to be a beginning of their forever. Instead, it became the end of everything. Emily had been late that night. He remembered the phone call, the trembling voice of a stranger telling him there had been an accident. A drunk driver had veered off course, slamming into Emily's car at precisely 7:07 p.m. She was gone before he could reach the hospital. From that day forward, 777 became a cruel talisman. The 7th day of the 7th month at 7:07 p.m., it was a pattern that seemed to follow him like a ghost, appearing on clocks, receipts, and even stock figures. Some days, it felt like Emily was trying to communicate with him through the numbers. On others, it felt like a cosmic joke, a reminder of all he had lost. The car rolled to a stop outside his penthouse, but Richard didn't move. His driver, sensing his mood, remained silent. Richard's thoughts were elsewhere, grappling with a memory he couldn't suppress. Instead of going inside, he murmured a new destination to the driver. "Take me to Willowbrook Cemetery." The driver hesitated but nodded. It wasn't the first time Richard had made this request, though he usually visited on specific anniversaries. The cemetery was a sacred place for him, the resting ground of Emily and the fragments of his shattered heart. The rain had lightened to a drizzle by the time they arrived. Richard stepped out, dismissing the driver with a wave. He preferred to make this pilgrimage alone. The familiar path through the cemetery was etched into his mind, each step heavy with memories. When he reached Emily's grave, he knelt before the polished headstone. His fingers traced the engraving, each letter a bittersweet echo of her name. Emily Grace Carter, he murmured. July 7, 1973. July 7, 1996. Another year, he said softly, his voice breaking. And I still miss you. Every day. For several minutes he sat in silence, the rain mingling with the tears that streamed down his face. He told her everything, about his successes, his failures, and the hollow existence he lived without her. Then, for the first time in years, he mentioned the peculiar encounter he'd had that day. There was a woman, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I gave her $777. I don't even know why. Maybe it was you. Maybe it's this damned number you left me with. I don't know, Emily. I just don't know. He bowed his head, the weight of grief and unanswered questions pressing down on him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. Standing a few rows away was a figure. As she moved closer, Richard's heart stopped. It was the same elderly woman he had helped earlier that day. She clutched a bouquet of wildflowers in her gnarled hands, her expression a mixture of sadness and determination. What are you doing here? Richard asked, rising to his feet, his voice tinged with disbelief. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between him and Emily's grave. I come here every year, she said quietly, to pay my respects. Richard's chest tightened. Respects? To Emily? How do you know her? The woman's face crumpled, her trembling lips forming words she seemed reluctant to say. Because she was my daughter. Richard staggered back, his mind racing. Emily's mother. But that wasn't possible. Emily had told him her parents had died when she was a teenager. You're lying, he said, his voice shaking. Emily's parents died years ago. She told me that herself. The woman's eyes brimmed with tears. She believed we were dead because we let her believe it, she said, her voice cracking. It was the only way we thought we could protect her. But we were wrong. So very wrong. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. Questions, accusations, and anger churned within him. But the only word he could manage was, why? As the rain began to fall harder, the woman looked at him with a pain so deep it mirrored his own. Because we caused the accident that took her from you, she whispered. And we've been living with that guilt ever since. Truths unearthed. The rain thickened, its relentless drumming drowning out the distant hum of city life. Richard stood frozen, Emily's grave, and the figure of the frail woman before him anchoring him in a moment that felt unreal. His breath came in uneven gasps as he tried to process what he had just heard. You caused the accident, he finally managed, his voice tight with disbelief and anger. Margaret nodded slowly, her wrinkled face etched with sorrow. Yes, we, my husband and I, we were responsible. But it was never supposed to happen. It was a mistake, a horrible, irreversible mistake. Richard clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the backdrop of the storm. Start from the beginning, he demanded. You owe me that much. Margaret motioned toward a nearby bench under a leafless tree. It offered little shelter from the rain, but neither of them seemed to care. Richard sat stiffly at one end, his eyes locked on her as though daring her to evade his questions. She lowered herself onto the bench, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. Emily was our only child, Margaret began, her voice barely audible above the rain. She was everything to us. Bright, determined, talented, but also headstrong. She had dreams, big dreams, that didn't align with the plans we had for her. Richard felt a pang of recognition. He had known that side of Emily well, her stubborn determination to forge her own path. She had often clashed with authority, but it was one of the things he had loved most about her. We were strict parents, Margaret continued, her gaze fixed on the muddy ground. Maybe too strict. We wanted the best for her, a stable career, financial security, a life free of struggle. When she told us she wanted to pursue art instead of law, we didn't take it well. Richard frowned. He remembered Emily's excitement when she had decided to leave law school to focus on her art. She had called it the most liberating decision of her life, but she had never mentioned the fallout with her parents. Margaret's voice cracked as she pressed on. The day of her birthday. We argued. It was ugly. We said things we can never take back. She ran out of the house, furious, and we followed her. Richard's jaw tightened. The image of Emily, vibrant and full of life, being chased by her own parents was almost too much to bear. We thought we could catch up to her, force her to come home, to listen to reason. Margaret said, her words tumbling out now, as if she had held them in for too long. But the roads were slick, and she was driving too fast. We didn't mean to push her so hard. We didn't mean. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Richard stared at her, his emotions a volatile mix of rage, grief, and confusion. "And then what?" he asked, his tone cold. "You just left her there." Margaret looked up, her face streaked with tears. "She lost control of the car," she whispered. "It spun off the road and hit a tree. We stopped, but by the time we reached her, she choked on the words, unable to say them aloud." Richard's chest tightened. He could picture it too vividly. Emily's car crumpled against the tree, her lifeless form trapped inside. The thought of her last moments, scared and alone, was unbearable. Margaret wiped her face with trembling hands. "We panicked," she admitted. "We were overwhelmed with guilt, with fear. We didn't know what to do. So we left. We left before anyone could see us, before anyone could ask questions. It was cowardly and selfish, but we were terrified of what would happen if the truth came out." Richard's fists clenched. "And you let her believe you were dead," he said, his voice rising. "You lied to your own daughter." Margaret nodded, shame etched into every line of her face. "We thought it would be easier for her to move on without us. We told ourselves it was for her, but deep down, we knew it was to protect ourselves. We couldn't face what we had done." Richard rose from the bench, pacing in front of her. The anger he had suppressed for so many years now burned hot in his chest. "Do you have any idea what you took from me? From her?" he demanded. "We were going to get married. We had a future. And you stole it." Margaret flinched at his words, but she didn't try to defend herself. "I know," she said softly, "and not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted it. That's why I come here, every year, to try to make peace with what I did. But there's no peace for someone like me." Richard turned to face her, his chest heaving with emotion. "Why now?" he asked. "Why are you telling me this after all these years?" Margaret looked at him with pleading eyes. "Because you deserve to know the truth, and because I saw how much you loved her, even after all this time. When I saw you today, I knew I couldn't keep this from you any longer." Her words softened something inside Richard, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. He turned away, his gaze falling on Emily's grave. The rain had washed away the flowers he had brought, leaving only the polished granite and the memories it held. "She didn't deserve this," he said quietly, more to himself than to Margaret. "None of us did." Margaret rose unsteadily from the bench, her frail frame trembling in the cold. "I know there's nothing I can say to make this right," she said. "But if there's any way I can help you find closure, I'll do whatever it takes." Richard remained silent, his thoughts racing. For years, he had carried the weight of Emily's death, blaming fate and chance. To now know the truth, to see the face of the person responsible, it was almost too much to bear. But as much as he hated Margaret in that moment, he could see the depth of her remorse. It mirrored his own grief in a way that was hauntingly familiar. After what felt like an eternity, Richard finally turned to face her. "You want to help me find closure?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. "Then start by telling me everything you remember about that day. Every detail." Margaret nodded, a flicker of hope in her tear-filled eyes. "I will," she promised. "But there's more. Things about Emily, about her last days, that you might not know. Things she told us before." Her voice trailed off, leaving Richard with a sinking feeling in his chest. He nodded curtly. "Then we start there," he said. "No more lies. No more hiding." As the rain began to ease, the two of them stood by Emily's grave, bound by their shared grief and the painful truths that had finally come to light. For Richard, it was the beginning of a journey he hadn't expected, one that would force him to confront not only the past, but also the future he had denied himself for so long. Echoes of a hidden life. The rain had faded into a light drizzle by the time Richard and Margaret moved away from Emily's grave. Despite the raw tension between them, an unspoken agreement bound them together. There was more to uncover, more to say. Margaret led the way to a small gazebo near the cemetery's edge. The wooden structure, though weathered and worn, provided some respite from the cold. Richard followed reluctantly, his mind a storm of anger, grief, and reluctant curiosity. As they sat facing each other, Margaret pulled her coat tighter around her frail frame. Her gnarled hands trembled slightly as she began to speak. "Before Emily left us, before that night, there were things she said, things I think you deserve to know," she started, her voice soft yet heavy with significance. "She talked about you, Richard, about how much you meant to her." Richard's heart clenched. Hearing Margaret speak of Emily in the present tense felt like ripping open a wound he tried to stitch closed for nearly 3 decades. "She loved you deeply," Margaret continued. "Even when we didn't understand her choices, she always defended you. She believed in your dreams, in the life you were building together." Richard remained silent, his gaze fixed on the gray horizon. He didn't trust himself to speak yet. Margaret took a shaky breath and pressed on. She also had fears," Margaret said, her voice faltering. "Not about you, but about herself. She worried she wouldn't be enough. That her art, her passions, wouldn't measure up to the future you deserved." Richard frowned. "She never told me that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always seemed so confident, so sure of herself." Margaret shook her head. "That's what she wanted you to see. She didn't want her insecurities to weigh on you. But she told us, in that argument. She said she felt trapped between the life we wanted for her and the life she wanted with you. We didn't listen. We only saw it as rebellion." The words stung. Richard had always known Emily was independent, but the idea that she had been quietly battling fears he never noticed made him feel as though he had failed her in some way. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What else?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "What else did she say?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes flickering with hesitation. "She told us she was pregnant," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard froze. The world seemed to tilt beneath him, and for a moment, he struggled to breathe. "What?" he asked, his voice sharp. "She was pregnant." Margaret nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She hadn't told you yet. She said she wanted to wait until her birthday to tell you, wanted it to be part of the celebration. She thought it would make the day even more special." Richard's heart raced. Emily had been pregnant. The thought was overwhelming, like being hit by a wave he couldn't outrun. He imagined her radiant with excitement, preparing to share the news. But that vision was shattered by the memory of the accident that had taken everything from them. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he demanded, his voice rising with anger. "Why didn't you come to me after she died? You had no right to keep this from me." Margaret flinched under his fury, but didn't look away. "I know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "We were selfish. We thought disappearing would make the pain go away. But it didn't. It only made it worse." Richard ran a hand through his rain-dampened hair, his mind racing. Emily had been carrying their child. A child he never got to meet, a future that had been stolen from him along with her. The weight of the revelation was unbearable. "There's more," Margaret said hesitantly. "Something I only discovered years later. After we left, I kept a box of Emily's things. Letters, sketches, memories. I didn't have the courage to look through it until recently. And when I did, I found a journal." "A journal?" Richard asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "Why are you just now telling me this?" Margaret's expression was one of shame and regret. "Because I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know if I had the right. But after seeing you today, after everything, I realized you deserve to know what's inside." Richard narrowed his eyes. "You have it with you." Margaret nodded and reached into her worn bag, pulling out a weathered leather journal. Its edges were frayed, and the once bright cover had dulled with time. She held it out to him, her hands shaking. "This belonged to Emily," she said softly. "It's filled with her thoughts, her dreams, and her plans for your future together. I think you should read it." Richard hesitated, his hand hovering over the journal. Taking it felt like crossing an invisible line, a step deeper into a past he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But curiosity and longing won out, and he took the journal from Margaret's outstretched hands. The cover felt oddly warm against his fingers, as though it carried the essence of Emily herself. He opened it carefully, the pages crackling softly as he flipped through them. Her handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, looping, and full of life. Each word seemed to leap off the page, carrying her voice with it. Richard read silently, his eyes scanning the pages. The entries were raw and unfiltered, a glimpse into Emily's soul. She wrote about her struggles with her parents, her excitement for the baby, and her dreams of building a life with Richard. She wrote about her love for him, how he made her feel alive, how she believed in the future they were creating together. But then, near the end of the journal, Richard's breath caught. One entry stood out, written just days before her death. "I've decided. After my birthday, I'm going to leave the city with Richard. We'll start fresh somewhere new, where I can focus on my art, and he can chase his dreams without the pressures of this life holding us back. I don't care what my parents think anymore. This is my life, and it's finally time to live it the way I want. I just hope Richard feels the same." Richard's hands trembled as he closed the journal. The words were both a balm and a dagger. Emily had believed in their future, even in the face of doubt and opposition. She had planned to leave everything behind for him. Margaret watched him cautiously. "I know it doesn't change what happened," she said quietly, "but I hope it helps you understand how much she loved you." Richard's voice was barely audible as he responded. "It changes everything," he said. "And yet, it changes nothing." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the rain pattering softly against the gazebo's roof. Richard's mind churned with questions, anger, and an overwhelming sadness that threatened to consume him. But beneath it all was a flicker of something else. Resolve. "I need time to think," he said finally, rising to his feet. He looked down at Margaret, his expression hard but not unkind. "This isn't over." Margaret nodded, understanding. "I'll be here," she said, "whenever you're ready." As Richard walked away, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. He felt as though he was stepping into a new chapter of his life, one where the ghosts of the past might finally find rest, and the truth might set him free. Shadows of forgiveness. The drive back to his penthouse was silent, the low hum of the engine barely registering in Richard's mind. The journal sat heavy in his lap, its worn leather cover now as familiar to him as the memories it held. He had read Emily's words, her unfiltered thoughts and dreams, and while they brought him closer to her than he had felt in years, they also deepened the ache of all he had lost. The city's skyline loomed in the distance as the Rolls-Royce pulled into the private driveway of his high-rise building. Richard stepped out into the cold drizzle, his driver offering a hesitant nod before disappearing into the rain. Inside the towering structure, the warm glow of the lobby lights felt at odds with the storm raging both outside and within Richard's heart. The elevator ride to his penthouse was agonizingly slow. He clutched the journal tightly, his thoughts a chaotic whirl. The revelations of the day, the truth about Emily's death, her hidden pregnancy, and the journal itself, left him reeling. When the elevator doors slid open, he stepped into his sprawling apartment, but the grandeur that usually provided a sense of control now felt hollow. Richard placed the journal on the coffee table and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He settled into the leather armchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the rain-soaked city. His mind replayed Margaret's confession in a loop. The weight of her words, her guilt, and her sorrow lingered like a shadow in the room. For hours, he sat there, torn between anger and an aching sense of understanding. Emily had lived a life of compromise, torn between her love for him and the expectations of her parents. The revelations from Margaret painted a fuller picture of the woman he had adored, a picture both beautiful and tragic. Finally, as the storm outside began to wane, Richard reached for the journal again. He flipped through its pages slowly this time, savoring each word. The journal wasn't just a collection of Emily's thoughts. It was a map of her soul, a glimpse into the life she had hoped to build with him. And yet, there was one entry that stood out above the rest. It was dated just 2 days before her birthday. "I keep thinking about what Richard and I could be if we just left this city behind. A place where I can paint without worrying about success, and he can escape the pressures of Wall Street. I see it so clearly in my mind. A little house by the ocean. Our child playing in the sand. Richard laughing again, free of the weight he always carries. It's all so close, but it feels so far. I just need the courage to take that step. And I think I finally have it." The image she painted was vivid, almost tangible, but it cut him deeply. It was a life they never got to have, stolen by a cruel twist of fate and the mistakes of others. The weight of her dreams pressed on his chest like an anchor, a visit to the past. The next morning, Richard woke with a sense of resolve. The journal had stirred something within him, a need to confront not just Margaret, but the ghosts of his own choices. For years, he had buried his pain under a mountain of wealth and success, thinking it would fill the void Emily's death had left. But now, he realized he had been wrong. No amount of money or power could bring him the peace he sought. Instead of heading to the office, Richard found himself driving toward a small, modest neighborhood in the Bronx. He had spent the night researching Margaret's whereabouts, and what he found had surprised him. After leaving Emily behind, Margaret and her husband had lived quietly, their lives marked by struggle and isolation. Her husband had passed away years ago, leaving Margaret alone. Richard pulled up to a weathered 2-story house with peeling paint and overgrown shrubs. The curtains on the front windows fluttered slightly, as though someone had been watching his approach. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Margaret opened it cautiously, her eyes widening when she saw him. "Richard," she said, her voice tinged with surprise and apprehension. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." "I need answers," Richard said bluntly. "And I need to understand why you did what you did, why you ran, why you stayed away, and why you're telling me all of this now." Margaret hesitated but then stepped aside, allowing him into the modest home. The interior was sparse but clean, the walls adorned with faded photographs and old paintings. Richard's eyes fell on one painting in particular, a landscape of a seaside village, its colors muted but beautiful. "That was one of Emily's," Margaret said softly, following his gaze. "She painted it when she was 19. It was the first time she told us she wanted to pursue art." Richard nodded, his chest tightening. Emily's talent had been extraordinary, and yet it had been one of the things her parents had tried to suppress. Margaret motioned for him to sit at the small kitchen table, where a pot of tea sat steaming. She poured a cup for each of them, her hands trembling slightly. "I know I've hurt you," she began, her voice heavy with remorse. "But I want you to know it wasn't easy for us to leave Emily behind. It was the hardest thing we've ever done." "Then why did you do it?" Richard asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "Why let her believe you were dead?" Margaret sighed, her eyes brimming with tears. Because we were cowards, she admitted. We thought disappearing would be easier than facing the consequences of our actions. We couldn't bear to look at her and know we were the reason she was suffering. And after the accident, we thought staying away would spare you both more pain. Richard shook his head, his frustration mounting. You didn't spare anyone pain. You just added to it. Emily died thinking her parents were gone, and I lost the chance to ever know the truth about her final days. Margaret reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it on his. I know, she said, her voice cracking. And I'm so sorry. I've spent every day of my life wishing I could undo what we did. But the truth is, I can't. All I can do now is try to make amends. Richard pulled his hand away, the anger still simmering beneath his grief. And what am I supposed to do with this? He asked, gesturing toward the journal he had brought with him. How am I supposed to move forward knowing what I've lost? Margaret's gaze was steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. You move forward by honoring her, she said simply, by living the life she wanted for you, the life she dreamed of in that journal. She loved you, Richard, and she wouldn't want you to carry this pain forever. Richard looked away, her words striking a chord he wasn't ready to acknowledge. For so long, his grief had been his anchor, his reason for keeping himself distant from the world. Letting go felt impossible, but as he glanced back at the painting on the wall, the seaside village Emily had captured so beautifully, something inside him shifted. He realized that carrying her memory didn't have to mean carrying the weight of her loss. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a way to honor her dreams without being consumed by the pain of her absence. A new path. The days following Richard's visit to Margaret were filled with an unusual stillness. His world, once dominated by the relentless pace of Wall Street and the constant hum of success, now felt muted, like a symphony missing its most vital notes. He worked only as much as necessary, delegating the majority of his responsibilities to his executive team. His focus was elsewhere, on Emily, her journal, and the question that now consumed him. What would she want him to do? One crisp morning, Richard found himself back in his penthouse, staring at the journal on his desk. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated its worn leather cover, making it seem almost alive. He opened it to the same entry he had read countless times over the past week. I keep thinking about what Richard and I could be if we just left this city behind. A place where I can paint without worrying about success, and he can escape the pressures of Wall Street. I see it so clearly in my mind. A little house by the ocean, our child playing in the sand, Richard laughing again, free of the weight he always carries. Richard ran a hand over his face, exhaling deeply. Emily's vision of their life together was so vivid, so pure, that it haunted him. For years, he had carried the weight of her death, allowing it to shape him into the man he had become, detached, driven, and emotionally impenetrable. But now, for the first time, he questioned whether that version of himself was what she would have wanted. An unlikely companion. Richard decided to reach out to Margaret again. Despite his lingering resentment, he couldn't deny that she had given him something invaluable. The truth, however painful it might be. He called her early one morning, his tone clipped but civil. "Margaret, it's Richard," he began. "I've been thinking. There's more I need to know about Emily, about the dreams she had before everything happened." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her voice soft when she finally responded. "I understand. Why don't you come over tomorrow? There are some things I haven't shared yet, things I think you should see." The next day, Richard found himself once again at Margaret's modest home. She greeted him at the door, her frailty more pronounced in the daylight. Yet there was a quiet strength about her, a determination that Richard couldn't ignore. In the living room, Margaret handed him a small weathered box. "These are some of Emily's belongings," she explained. "Things she left behind when she moved out. I couldn't bring myself to look at them for years, but I think they belong to you now." Richard opened the box carefully, his heart pounding. Inside were fragments of Emily's life, sketches of landscapes and portraits, a stack of letters she had written but never sent, and a small velvet pouch containing a locket. He opened the locket to find a tiny photograph of them together, taken during one of their happiest days, a picnic in Central Park. She carried that locket everywhere, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. It was one of her most treasured possessions. Richard closed his eyes, clutching the locket tightly. The memories it stirred were bittersweet, a reminder of what they had shared and what had been stolen from them. Among the sketches, one stood out. It was a rough but detailed drawing of a seaside cottage, nestled among dunes with waves crashing in the distance. In the corner of the page, Emily had scrawled a note, "One day, this will be our home." The image hit Richard like a thunderbolt. He realized that Emily's dreams weren't just abstract ideas. They were specific, tangible visions she had cherished. For years, he had been trapped in the past, reliving the pain of her loss. But now he saw a path forward, one that honored her memory while allowing him to find peace. Chasing the dream. That night, Richard made a decision. He would step away from the life he had built, the empire of wealth and power that had become a gilded cage. Instead, he would pursue the life Emily had envisioned for them, a life of simplicity and meaning. The next morning, Richard called his attorney and financial advisor. "I'm restructuring Lawson Enterprises," he announced. "I'll remain as chairman, but I'm appointing a new CEO to handle the day-to-day operations. I need time to focus on something else." His team was stunned, but Richard didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. He spent the next few weeks tying up loose ends, liquidating unnecessary assets, and searching for the perfect seaside property. He scoured listings, driven by the image Emily had sketched in her journal. Finally, he found it, a quaint cottage on the coast of Maine. It wasn't an exact match to Emily's drawing, but it was close enough to feel like fate. The cottage was small but cozy, with weathered shingles and a wraparound porch that overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. Richard purchased it without hesitation. A new beginning. Moving into the cottage was both liberating and bittersweet. Richard furnished it sparingly, leaving the walls bare except for Emily's sketches, which he framed and hung with care. He found himself drawn to the simplicity of life by the sea, long walks on the beach, the soothing rhythm of the waves, and the quiet solitude that allowed him to reflect. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard stood on the porch, the journal in one hand and a glass of wine in the other. He thought of Emily, of her laughter, her passion, and the life they had planned together. Though she was gone, her presence was everywhere, in the house, in the waves, and in the dreams she had left behind. For the first time in years, Richard smiled, a real, unguarded smile. He realized that while he would always miss Emily, he didn't have to be defined by his grief. By honoring her dreams, he was reclaiming a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. A chance encounter. One morning, as Richard walked along the shoreline, he noticed a figure sitting on the sand. It was a young woman with a sketchpad in her lap, her hands moving deftly as she captured the scene before her. Something about her reminded him of Emily, her focus, her creative spirit. Curious, Richard approached her. "That's a beautiful sketch," he said, nodding toward her work. The woman looked up, startled, but then smiled. "Thank you," she said. "The ocean is my favorite subject. It's always changing, always alive." They struck up a conversation, sharing stories of their lives and what had brought them to this quiet stretch of coast. Though their meeting was brief, it left Richard with a sense of possibility. He realized that life, like the ocean, was always changing, sometimes unpredictable, sometimes cruel, but always full of potential. As he walked back to the cottage, Richard felt a renewed sense of hope. Emily's love and dreams had brought him to this place, but it was up to him to decide what came next, and for the first time in years, he was ready to embrace whatever the future held. The heart's true calling. It had been 6 months since Richard Lawson had left the concrete jungle of New York City behind. In that time, He had transformed both his life and his surroundings, but it wasn't without struggle. The transition from the relentless, high-octane world of Wall Street to the quietude of coastal Maine had been jarring. The rhythms of this new life, slow, deliberate, and full of space, were starkly different from the feverish pace he had known for decades. But each day, he felt himself shedding layers of who he had been, and uncovering, bit by bit, the man he wanted to become. In the cottage, surrounded by Emily's sketches and the soft sound of the ocean's constant whisper, Richard found a kind of peace he had never known in the city. At first, the silence was almost unbearable. For years, the sound of ringing phones, board meetings, and city noise had been the soundtrack of his existence. But here, in the presence of nature, in the vastness of the sea, Richard learned to embrace the quiet, to listen more deeply, and to allow space for something new to grow. His decision to leave the world of high finance behind wasn't as simple as walking away. There were days when the temptation to return to his old life crept in, when the lure of the hustle and the allure of power seemed more inviting than the uncertainty of starting anew. Yet every time his mind wandered back to his past life, it was Emily's dreams that pulled him back. The life she had envisioned for them, the life he had abandoned after her death, was a beacon, a reminder that there was more to life than the wealth and prestige that had once consumed him. It was in this quiet place that Richard began to work on the one thing he had been avoiding for years: his own healing. The grief that had locked him in a cage for so long was beginning to soften, and with it came the realization that he could not move forward without truly facing his past. He had spent far too long avoiding the one thing that would set him free: forgiveness. Forgiving Margaret. Margaret Thompson, Emily's mother, had been a constant presence in Richard's thoughts. Her confession, the heavy burden of guilt she had carried for so many years, had torn through his world like a storm. But Richard had learned something invaluable in the months since their conversation: the power of empathy, the necessity of understanding that sometimes the people who hurt us are themselves broken and in need of healing. Margaret's letters had arrived sporadically at first, each one an apology, an attempt to bridge the chasm between them. Richard had kept them all, reading each one in silence, his heart softening with every word. He had learned of her life after Emily's death, the unbearable weight of the accident, her self-imposed exile, and the remorse that haunted her every day. Richard could no longer view Margaret through the lens of anger. Her pain was not an excuse for the choices she had made, but it was a part of the complex human condition they all shared. After some reflection, Richard decided to reach out to her, not as the man who had lost his fiancée, but as someone who understood loss on a deeper level. One morning, as the fog rolled in from the sea, Richard dialed the familiar number on his phone. Margaret's voice on the other end was frail but steady. "Richard," she said, almost as if she couldn't believe he had called. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I know," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think it's time we talked. Not just about the past, but about what comes next." Margaret paused, and Richard could hear the tension in her breath. "What comes next?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Forgiveness," Richard said simply. "Not for what you did to me, but for what we both need. I think it's time to let go of the past." There was a long silence on the line before Margaret finally spoke. "Richard, I never thought you'd say that." "I didn't either," Richard admitted, his eyes closing as he leaned back in his chair. "But it's time. It's time to let Emily's memory live without the weight of anger and guilt." They agreed to meet in a few days, a quiet encounter that would not erase the past, but hopefully offer some kind of peace. The peace of the sea. The meeting with Margaret took place in a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far from the busy streets and the weight of the city. Richard arrived early, pacing outside as he watched the waves crash on the shore. The familiar rhythm of the ocean, ever-changing but constant, gave him a strange sense of calm. In the past, he would have walked into such a meeting with a sense of power, with the expectation that he would control the conversation. But now there was only the need to listen, to hear Margaret's story and perhaps allow her to hear his. Margaret arrived a few minutes later, her face lined with age and grief. She had always been a woman of grace, even in the hardest times, but there was an undeniable weariness in her eyes. She sat down across from Richard, her hands trembling as she placed them on the table. "I didn't expect you to be so kind," she said quietly. Richard smiled, though it was bittersweet. "I didn't expect it either. But I've learned that kindness is often the only way to heal." They spoke for hours, sharing their thoughts, their regrets, and their desires for what remained of their lives. Margaret spoke about Emily's final days, her undying love for Richard, and the guilt that had bound her for so long. She spoke of the moments she wished she could take back, of the way she had hidden from the truth, hoping the pain would fade with time. Richard shared his own journey of healing, from the years of anger that had consumed him to the decision he had made to leave the city behind. He spoke of Emily's dreams, the life she had wanted to build, and how he had finally realized that he needed to live for her, not for his own achievements, but for the vision of life she had always carried in her heart. By the end of the meeting, both were exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. Margaret reached across the table and took Richard's hand, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never thought I would hear you say those words. I never thought I'd be able to forgive myself." Richard squeezed her hand. "It's not just you who needs forgiveness," he said softly. "It's me too. I needed to forgive myself for holding on to the anger, for letting it define my life." For the first time in years, Richard felt a profound sense of peace. It was not the kind of peace that came from erasing the past, but the kind that came from accepting it, allowing it to shape him without controlling him. A life worth living. Months passed, and Richard settled into a rhythm of life that he could have never imagined in New York. The cottage by the sea became a sanctuary, a place of deep reflection and growth. He still missed Emily, her laughter, her spirit, but he had learned to carry her memory in a way that honored her. Each day, he found himself painting again, something he hadn't done since he was a young man, before the weight of ambition had taken over. In the town, he was no longer the enigmatic millionaire who had come from the city to hide. He had become something else, a man who had seen the depths of pain and loss, and had chosen to embrace love and forgiveness instead of bitterness. One evening, as Richard stood on the porch of his cottage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a soft breeze tug at his hair. He could almost hear Emily's voice, whispering in the wind, urging him to let go, to move forward. And so he did. With each passing day, Richard lived a life more authentic than the one he had known before, a life shaped not by the demands of others, but by his own heart's true calling. And in that life, surrounded by the ocean's steady rhythm, Richard found the freedom he had been searching for all along. The days blended into months, and as autumn arrived in Maine, Richard Lawson's transformation was becoming evident not just to himself, but to those who had begun to know him in the small coastal town. The former titan of Wall Street had been replaced by a man who was gentle, reflective, and increasingly more in tune with the rhythm of life. One crisp morning, Richard stood on the edge of the cliffs overlooking the ocean, the wild waves crashing against the rocks below. It was a scene he had witnessed countless times, but today, something was different. The mist in the air, the salt on his lips, the howl of the wind. It all felt as though nature itself was speaking to him, calling him to live in harmony with the world around him. It was as if, in the quiet solitude of this place, he had finally found the clarity he had been searching for. For the first time in years, Richard could breathe deeply without the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. The city's chaos, his company's demands, and the anger he had carried for so long had all faded into the distance. He could feel Emily's presence beside him, not in the way he had imagined in his grief, but as a gentle breeze that seemed to brush against his cheek, as if reassuring him that he was on the right path. A letter from Margaret. The months after Richard's meeting with Margaret had been a time of quiet reconciliation, but there were moments when the weight of their shared history would surface. The guilt that had been locked in both of their hearts had been let out, but it still lingered in quiet corners of their conversations. Margaret, for all her years of torment, had never truly forgiven herself, not in the way Richard had hoped. She still visited Emily's grave, often sitting in silence for hours, reflecting on the choices that had haunted her for decades. One morning, as Richard was sitting by his study desk, a letter arrived. It was from Margaret. At first glance, it seemed like one of the many she had sent over the months, each one filled with apologies and attempts to rebuild what had been broken. But as he tore open the envelope, he found something different, something more final. The letter was long, filled with the deep sorrow Margaret had carried for so long. It told of a quiet acceptance that had finally taken root in her heart, something she had not been able to embrace until now. I have lived my life in the shadows of my mistakes, Richard, but I can finally say that I am at peace, not in the way I thought I would be, but in a way I never expected. I have come to understand that forgiveness, true forgiveness, comes not just from others, but from ourselves. I don't think I'll ever be free of the pain I've caused, but I no longer live for my own guilt. I live because Emily's spirit is still with me, and I owe it to her to honor her memory. Margaret went on to explain that she had made the decision to sell her home and move to a small town in the Midwest, where she hoped to begin anew. She wanted to live the rest of her years in a way that would honor Emily, far away from the place where their lives had collided in tragedy. Richard read the letter with quiet reverence, his heart heavy with both sadness and relief. Margaret was finally letting go of the past, moving toward a future that she had spent so many years avoiding. The unexpected visit. It had been 2 years since Richard had left New York, and though he was content in his new life, there were times when the past would come knocking. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, Richard heard a knock at his front door. It was a soft, tentative knock, as though the person on the other side wasn't sure if they should be there. Richard opened the door to find a young woman standing before him, her eyes wide with nervousness. She was in her mid-20s with dark hair and a look of confusion in her eyes, but there was something hauntingly familiar about her. For a moment, Richard could not place her. "Mr. Lawson," she asked hesitantly. "Are you Richard Lawson?" "Yes, that's me," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. "Can I help you?" The woman looked down for a moment, taking a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she had to say. I don't know how to say this, but I think you knew my mother." Richard felt a jolt of recognition. "Your mother?" "My name is Leila," she said softly. "Leila Thompson. My mother was Emily Thompson." The name hit him like a thunderclap. Leila Thompson, Emily's daughter. Richard's heart stopped for a moment, as memories of the love he had shared with Emily flooded back. His mind raced, and he tried to make sense of the sudden arrival of this woman standing on his doorstep, claiming to be Emily's daughter. But how could that be possible? Emily had never had children. Leila stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I know this must be a shock," she continued, "but I need to speak with you. I need to understand. My mother spoke about you before she passed away, and I need to know everything about her. About you. About the life you two shared." Richard stood frozen for a moment, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Emily's mother had kept this secret, a secret that would forever change everything he thought he knew. Emily had always spoken of her parents as if they had been long gone, a painful memory she had never fully confronted. But now, there was a daughter standing in front of him, a piece of Emily's legacy that he had never known existed. "Come inside," Richard said, his voice soft but resolute. "We have a lot to talk about." The healing truth. That evening, Richard and Leila sat together by the fire, the warmth of the hearth contrasting with the weight of the conversation that lay ahead. Leila explained that she had never known her mother's full story. She had grown up in foster care, raised by a couple who had kept the secret of her biological mother's identity. Only after Margaret's passing did Leela discover the truth about her birth, and it was a truth that had remained buried for so long. "My mother kept so many things from me," Leela said, her voice trembling. "I always wondered why she never spoke about her life before me, why there were so many gaps. But now I understand. She didn't want me to carry the same pain that had haunted her for so long." Richard listened in silence, his heart heavy with the knowledge of how deep the roots of grief could grow. He had known Emily in ways that were intimate and beautiful, but he had never known the full extent of the burden she had carried, the secrets, the unresolved trauma from her past. "I'm sorry," Richard said after a long silence. I never knew there was so much pain, so much unsaid. If I had known about you, about your mother's struggles, I would have fought harder to keep her in my life, to keep both of you in my life." Leela's eyes filled with tears. "It's not your fault. I think my mother just needed to keep those parts of her life hidden. She didn't want me to feel the weight of the mistakes, of the pain. I think she thought she could protect me by keeping it all to herself." They sat in silence for a long while, each lost in their thoughts. The conversation was difficult, but there was an undeniable sense of closure in it. Richard had learned to forgive, to understand. And now, in this moment, he was finally confronting the truth of Emily's life, and of his own. "I want to know more," Leela said softly, breaking the silence. "About her. About you. The love you shared." Richard nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a sense of finality. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "I owe that to you, to Emily." And so, as the night deepened, Richard began to speak of Emily, of the life they had shared, of the love they had built, and the heartbreak that had torn them apart. But it was no longer a story of loss. It was a story of connection, of healing, and of love that transcended the limits of time and grief. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Richard realized that he had come full circle. He had found the peace he had been searching for, not in forgetting the past, but in understanding it, accepting it, and ultimately letting it go. Emily's love had never truly left him. It had shaped his entire journey, guiding him to this moment of complete healing and renewal. And in that healing, Richard knew that he could finally let go of the past and move forward, not alone, but with the love that had once defined him, now transformed into something more enduring, something more powerful, something that would last for generations to come.